The wind cut across the open prairie, carrying with it a sharp bite that hinted at snow. It was the kind of day when most folks stayed inside, close to the fire, letting the world do what it would without them, but not Samuel Carter. A lonely rancher had been riding since dawn, checking his fences along the northern ridge. His dark bay horse Duke left a steady trail of prints behind them in the soft, frozen earth. Samuel had learned long ago that the land didn't care if you were tired or lonely, it demanded your attention. And if you didn't give it, it took something from you in return. He was a man of few words, with a quiet, weathered face that carried the weight of years spent in solitude. He had no wife, no children. The only voices that spoke to him most days were the low rumble of Duke's breath and the whisper of the wind. But that afternoon, something unusual caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a patch of shadow cast by a cloud drifting across the plains. Then the shadow moved. His hand tightened on the reins, and he leaned forward in the saddle, narrowing his eyes against the glare. Out on the trail, half hidden in a hollow, was a wagon, or what was left of one. The wooden frame was broken, a wheel lying several feet away. The canvas cover had been ripped by the wind, snapping like a wounded bird's wing. Samuel could see no team of horses, no driver, no sign of anyone alive. He would have ridden on, assuming it was just another abandoned relic of a family who hadn't made it, if not for the faintest flicker of movement near the wagon's side. He slowed Duke to a walk, the leather of his saddle creaking in the silence. When he was close enough, he saw them. A woman sat in the dirt, her back against the splintered side of the wagon. Her hair was tangled, her face pale, eyes half-lidded, as if she were somewhere far away. Beside her, wrapped in a thin blanket, was a little girl no older than 6 clutching her mother's arm with trembling fingers. The child's wide eyes locked onto Samuel the moment she saw him, filled with both fear and a desperate hope she didn't dare believe in. Samuel swung down from his horse, boots crunching against the frozen ground. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low but firm. The woman didn't respond. The girl, however, took a tiny step forward, her lips trembling. "She's cold," the child whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. "Mama's cold." Samuel's eyes shifted to the woman. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and he could see the way her chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths. Without wasting another moment, he pulled his canteen from his saddlebag and knelt beside her. "What happened?" he asked, glancing between them. The girl hesitated. "They left us," she said finally. "The men, they took the horses." Sad Mama was too slow. Samuel felt his jaw tighten. Out here, being left behind was as good as a death sentence. He looked at the girl, at the dirt smudges on her cheeks, at the way she clung to her thin blanket as though it could keep the cold at bay. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than to them. "We're not going to let that happen." Moving with purpose, Samuel took off his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around the woman's shoulders. He lifted her gently. She was lighter than he expected and set her across Duke's back. Then he looked at the girl. "Can you ride?" She nodded quickly, though Samuel could see she was shaking more from fear than from the cold. He helped her up behind her mother, securing them both as best he could. When they were ready, he mounted up, one arm steadying the woman in front of him, the other guiding Duke toward the distant line of hills where his ranch lay hidden. Wind picked up, carrying the promise of snow, but Samuel leaned forward and urged his horse on. There'd be time for questions later. For now, all that mattered was getting them to safety before the cold claimed them as the prairie stretched. Out behind them, Samuel couldn't shake the thought that he'd ridden out that day expecting nothing but another lonely evening. Instead, fate had placed 2 strangers in his path, strangers who now depended on him for their very lives. And though he didn't yet know their names, Something deep in his chest told him that this encounter was about to change everything. Asterisk. The next morning, Samuel woke before dawn. The sky was still a deep bluish gray, with the first blush of orange stretching across the horizon. He moved quietly through the cabin so as not to wake Clara and little Emily. The wood stove had gone cold overnight, and the air inside had that sharp bite of winter creeping in early. He crouched, tossing in kindling and coaxing the fire back to life until it crackled warm and steady dot in the far corner. Clara stirred on the small bed Samuel had set up for her and Emily. Her hair was loose, tumbling over her shoulders, and for a brief moment she looked younger, almost like the years of hardship had rolled back. She blinked at the light of the flames, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "You're up early," she said softly, pulling the thin blanket tight around her shoulders. "Got work to do," Samuel replied. He poured her a cup of hot coffee, setting it on the table. "Drink this while it's warm. You and Emily need all the heat you can get." She hesitated before taking it, like she wasn't used to such small kindnesses. Emily, still curled up under the quilt, peeked over at Samuel with shy eyes before burying her face again. Samuel left them with the fire and stepped outside into the cold morning. His breath came out in white clouds as he fed the animals, chopped more wood, and checked the fence line. The chores gave him time to think. Clara and Emily couldn't stay forever. This ranch was no place for two women alone, especially if whoever left them out there came looking again. But Samuel couldn't deny the feeling that had been gnawing at him since he found them. The way Emily's small hand had clung to his coat. The way Clara's eyes had searched his face that first night, like she was looking for some proof of safety. When he returned to the cabin, the smell of warm bread met him. Clara had found the flour and baked something simple, but to Samuel it felt like a feast. Emily sat at the table, swinging her legs and nibbling on a piece, her face smeared with crumbs. "You didn't have to do this," Samuel said, setting down the bucket of water he'd hauled in. "I wanted to," Clara replied. "It's the least I could do after you saved us." Saved us. The words stuck in Samuel's mind. He'd never thought of himself as anyone's savior. He was just a rancher, doing what any decent man should. After breakfast, Samuel offered to show Emily the barn. She followed him eagerly, clutching her small shawl against the wind. He introduced her to his old mare Dusty and let her feed the horse from her tiny hands. Emily giggled when Dusty's warm breath tickled her fingers. Clara stood at the barn door, watching, a faint smile touching her lips. But the light moment didn't last long. That afternoon, while Samuel was repairing the corral, he spotted something on the rigid figure on horseback, too far to make out clearly, but close enough to set his nerves on edge. The rider stayed just long enough to be noticed before turning and disappearing into the trees. When Samuel came back inside, he didn't mention what he'd seen. Clara seemed calmer than she had been, and Emily was humming softly as she played with a scrap of fabric Clara had sewn into a tiny doll. He didn't want to break the fragile peace of the moment, but in the back of his mind, Samuel knew trouble had a way of finding its way down the trail. And whatever had forced Clara and Emily into the cold wilderness might not be finished yet. That night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Samuel found Clara sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "There's something you're not telling me," he said quietly. Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the quilt. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "If I tell you, Samuel, you might wish you'd never stopped for us." He crouched beside her, his voice steady. "That's not going to happen." Her eyes finally met his, and in them Samuel saw a flicker of fear and something else. A determination that, whatever her story was, she had fought hard to survive it. She took a deep breath. "We were running, because the man I was supposed to marry turned out to be someone far worse than I imagined." The fire popped and hissed between them, and Samuel knew he was only hearing the beginning. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Samuel guided his horse toward the shelter of an old cottonwood grove. The ground was soft beneath the hooves, and each step left a deep print in the mud. Behind him, the wagon creaked, its wheels splattered with dirt. Inside, the little girl lay curled beneath a worn blanket, and her mother sat beside her, hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken much since they'd started moving. Samuel could tell by the way she glanced out at the horizon almost nervously that she was used to running. Something told him this wasn't the first time trouble had been close behind. He didn't press her for answers, not yet. A man could read more from silence than words sometimes, and right now her silence told him plenty. They stopped in the grove so Samuel could check the horses and give them water. He also wanted to give the woman and child a moment to breathe without the constant jostling of the wagon. He climbed down, stretching his stiff legs, and began unfastening a small barrel from the side. The little girl peeked out from under the blanket, her brown hair tangled and damp. She had that wide-eyed look children got when the world had been cruel too soon. Samuel offered her a canteen of fresh water. "Here," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Take a drink. You'll feel better." She hesitated, glancing at her mother as if for permission. The woman gave a small nod, and the girl took the canteen with both hands. She drank greedily, then wiped her mouth with her sleeve before handing it back. "What's your name?" Samuel asked. "Emma," she replied softly. He smiled faintly. "Emma's a strong name. You hold on to that." The mother looked away, her eyes fixed on the distant hills. Samuel could see the way her shoulders tensed, as if she were listening for something. Hooves, voices, anything that might mean danger was near. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but edged with weariness. "You should know. If you take us with you, you might be bringing trouble to your door." Samuel poured water into a tin for the horses, his expression unreadable. "I've lived alone a long time, ma'am. Trouble's not something I go looking for. But I've learned it has a way of finding a man whether he wants it or not." She folded her arms. "You don't understand. The men chasing us," she stopped herself, biting her lip. "They're not the kind who give up easy." He met her gaze evenly. "Then they'll have to deal with me." For a moment, they just looked at each other. She searched his face, maybe trying to figure out whether he was the sort of man who made promises lightly. Samuel didn't flinch under her stare. Life on the frontier had a way of shaping a man's eyes to match the land, steady, weathered, and impossible to bluff. After a pause, he said, "I've got a place about a day's ride from here. It's not much, just a small ranch house and some land, but it's safe. You and your girl can stay until you decide what's next." The little girl's eyes brightened, but the mother's expression stayed guarded. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help strangers like us?" Samuel shrugged slightly. "Because once a stranger helped me. I never forgot it." She didn't answer right away. The drizzle had stopped entirely now, and a pale light began breaking through the clouds. It lit the damp grass in a silver sheen and made the steam rise gently from the horses' backs. Finally, she nodded. "All right, we'll go with you." Samuel gave a small nod in return. He didn't smile, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his eyes, like a man who'd made a decision he knew was right. They climbed back into the wagon, and Samuel took up the reins. As the horses started forward again, the grove faded behind them, swallowed by the rolling hills. The road ahead was still long, and whatever shadows were chasing the woman and her daughter might not be far behind. But for now, there was a fragile peace in that small wagon, a kind of unspoken promise that, at least tonight, they would be safe. And Samuel intended to keep that promise, no matter what the cost. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The air turned sharper, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Samuel slid off his horse first, then gently lifted the little girl, who clung to him as if afraid that letting go would send her back to the trail. Her mother followed, swaying on unsteady legs. The cabin was small but sturdy, its logs darkened from years of weather. Smoke drifted from the chimney, promising warmth inside. Samuel pushed the door open, letting them in first. The interior was plain: one table, 2 chairs, a wood stove crackling with heat, and a cot in the corner. It wasn't much, but compared to the freezing night outside, it felt like a sanctuary. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the cot. "You need to get warm." The woman sank onto the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughter. Samuel stoked the fire. Higher, the orange glow flickering across the room. He poured hot water from the kettle into a tin mug, then rummaged through a cabinet for dried venison and cornbread. It wasn't a feast, but it would keep them alive. The little girl accepted the food timidly, her eyes darting between her mother and Samuel. She nibbled the bread in tiny bites, as though afraid it might disappear. Samuel watched them in silence, noting the way the woman's hands trembled as she ate. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion had clearly worn them thin. When their bellies were full, Samuel asked the question he'd been holding back. "What happened out there? Who left you?" The woman hesitated, her gaze falling to the floor. The fire popped in the stove. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and rough. "We were traveling west. My husband, he fell ill on the trail. The others said we were slowing them down. They left us with nothing, said we'd be dead by morning anyway." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd seen hard decisions made on the frontier, but abandoning a woman and child to die was something else entirely. "How long have you been walking?" he asked. 2 days, she whispered. "We had no food, no water. I thought—" She broke off, swallowing hard, and pressed her daughter closer. The little girl looked up at Samuel with wide, earnest eyes. "Mama told me to be brave," she said softly, "but I was scared." Samuel felt something shift in his chest. He wasn't. A man used to company, and he'd lived years without anyone relying on him. But seeing them there, fragile and desperate, stirred a sense of duty he couldn't ignore. "You're safe now," he said simply. "No one's going to hurt you here." The woman's shoulders loosened just a little, though she still looked at him like she wasn't sure if safety was even possible anymore. Samuel fetched a wool blanket from a trunk and draped it over them, noticing how both mother and daughter sank into its warmth like they'd been cold for far too long. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, but inside it was quiet only. The steady hum of the stove and the soft sound of the little girl breathing as she began to drift to sleep. Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying them in the firelight. He told himself it was just one night. In the morning, he'd figure out where they could go, who might take them in. But deep down, something told him that once they stepped into his life, they wouldn't be so easily gone. The woman looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you stop for us? Most men would have kept riding." Samuel met her gaze steadily. "Because I know what it's like to be left behind." She didn't ask him to explain, and he didn't offer. But for the first time since they met, her eyes softened as the fire burned lower. Samuel realized the trail had brought them together by chance or maybe by something greater. Either way, the cabin didn't feel as empty as it had the day before. And though he didn't yet know their names, he knew this. Come morning, he wouldn't let them face the world alone again. The first days on Samuel's ranch were a strange mix of quiet tension and unexpected comfort. The land stretched wide and empty, the air filled with the scent of hay and the distant sound of cattle moving in the pastures. Clara spent her mornings helping in the kitchen, mending old curtains, and trying to make herself useful. Lily, on the other hand, clung to Samuel like a shadow, following him out to the barn, watching him feed the horses and asking questions about every tool and rope. She saw that Samuel didn't mind. In fact, there was a subtle shift in him whenever the little girl was around, a softness in his voice, a patience in his manner. He showed her how to brush the horses and taught her the names of the barn cats. For a man known for his solitude, it was a sight that would have surprised anyone who knew him. Still, Clara kept her distance. She was grateful, yes, but there was an invisible wall between her and Samuel. Every time their eyes met, she saw not just kindness but something unspoken, like he was holding back questions he didn't dare to ask. And she, in turn, carried secrets she wasn't ready to share. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple, Samuel sat out on the porch with his coffee. Clara stepped out, hesitating before joining him. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of crickets filling the air. "You don't owe me anything," Samuel finally said, his voice steady but quiet. Clara glanced at him. "I know, but I can't help but wonder," he continued. "What kind of man leaves a woman and child on the trail like that?" She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the cup she held. "Not a man," she said softly. "A group of men, and they weren't strangers." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he didn't press further. He could see the way her eyes shifted, the way her body tensed as if the memory itself was a knife. Whatever happened, it wasn't his business, at least, not yet. The next morning brought an unexpected change. Samuel had to ride into town for supplies, and he offered to take them with him. Clara hesitated. Town meant eyes, questions, gossip, but Lily's face lit up at the idea. And so, with a quiet sigh, Clara agreed. The ride into town was long but beautiful. Lily's laughter echoed in the open air as Samuel's horse trotted alongside the wagon. Clara found herself watching him when he didn't notice, the way he sat tall in the saddle, the way he scanned the horizon as if always ready for trouble. When they arrived in town, Samuel was quick to handle his errands, but it didn't take long for whispers to start. People stared at Clara, at Lily, at the man who had brought them. A shopkeeper's wife leaned toward another woman, murmuring behind her hand. Samuel caught it, and his voice turned sharp. "You got something to say it to me." The women quickly looked away, muttering excuses. Clara felt a pang of shame, not because of the whispers themselves, but because she was dragging Samuel into whatever storm followed her. On the way back to the ranch, a light rain began to fall, soft at first and then steady. Samuel pulled the wagon under a grove of trees to wait it out. They sat in the shelter, listening to the patter of rain on the canvas. "Why are you doing this for us?" Clara asked suddenly, the question spilling out before she could stop it. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "Because I know what it's like to have no one." It was a simple answer, but it struck something deep in Clara. For the first time since she met him, she saw not just a man helping out of duty or pity, but someone who understood, in his own quiet way, what it meant to be left behind. When the rain cleared and they rode the rest of the way home, something in the air between them had shifted. The wall was still there, but now there was a small crack in it. What neither of them knew was that far down the trail, trouble was already stirring again, trouble that had no intention of letting Clara and Lily go so easily. The wind howled across the open prairie that night, rattling the shutters of Samuel's small ranch house. Inside, the fire burned low, casting warm orange light across the room. Emily lay in the bed, her breathing softer now, though Samuel could tell she was still fighting the remnants of fever. Little Sarah sat beside her, holding her mother's hand like she was afraid to let go. Samuel had spent the past week nursing them both back to health. The first 2 days had been the hardest. Emily's fever spiked dangerously high, and Samuel had sat by her side through the night, dabbing her forehead with cool water. coaxing her to sip broth when she was strong enough to open her eyes. Sarah had hardly left her mother's side, except when Samuel gently carried her to the kitchen for a slice of bread or a cup of warm milk. That evening, as Samuel stirred the stew simmering on the stove, Sarah's voice broke the quiet. "Mr. Samuel," she said softly, "why did you help us?" Samuel paused, ladle in hand. He turned toward the little girl, meeting her wide brown eyes. "Because nobody should be left to die on the trail," he said simply. "And because I reckon I couldn't just ride past." Sarah tilted her head as if weighing his words, then gave a tiny nod. "Mama says you're the kindest man she's ever met." Samuel felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. He quickly turned back to the stove, pretending to focus on the stew. By morning, Emily was able to sit up for the first time since arriving. Samuel brought her a tray with bread, eggs, and a steaming cup of coffee. "You've done too much for us," she said, her voice still hoarse but steady. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't owe me anything," Samuel replied. "Just get better. That's all that matters." But Emily's eyes held a flicker of worry. "When we're strong enough, we'll need to move on. The man who left us out there, he might still be looking." Samuel's jaw tightened. "You mean to tell me someone meant for you to die?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "It wasn't just bad luck. We were abandoned on purpose." The confession burned in Samuel's mind all day. He knew trouble when he saw it, and this trouble wasn't going to just blow over with the wind. Whoever had done this to Emily and Sarah might come sniffing around, and if they did, Samuel would be ready. That afternoon, while Emily rested, Samuel took Sarah outside to help him feed the horses. She giggled as the biggest Mare nuzzled her hand, searching for a carrot. For the first time since finding them, Samuel saw the shadow of fear lift from the girl's face. It made him realize something: these two had brought life back into his quiet home just as much as he had saved theirs. By evening, the air grew tense again. Samuel noticed a set of fresh wagon tracks cutting across the far edge of his property. He crouched down, studying them. The wheel ruts were narrow, too narrow for a supply wagon. He followed the trail a few yards, just enough to see boot prints alongside the tracks. Whoever it was, they hadn't come close to the house, but they'd been watching. When he returned, Emily caught sight of the worry on his face. "They've found us, haven't they?" she asked quietly. "I don't know yet," Samuel answered, but his voice was firm. "What I do know is you're safe here. I won't let anyone take you or Sarah." That night, Samuel loaded his rifle and set it by the door. The prairie was silent, but he could feel the storm gathering, one that had nothing to do with the weather. He didn't know yet who he was going to face, but for the first time in years, he had something worth fighting for. Emily lay awake in the next room, staring at the ceiling. She knew Samuel meant every word, but she also knew the kind of man. They were up against a man who didn't take no for an answer. Her hand reached for Sarah's, holding it tightly as if she could shield her from the world just by not letting go. Out on the dark horizon, a faint lantern light moved slowly across the plain, getting closer. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the prairie wrapped in a soft golden dawn. Samuel stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under his boots, and looked toward the barn where Lily was already tending to the horses. For someone so small, she had energy that seemed to come from some hidden wellspring. Nearby, her mama Emily was hanging damp clothes on the line, the morning sun catching strands of her chestnut hair. It was an image that lodged itself deep in Samuel's mind, quiet, simple, and safe, but safety was fragile out here. Samuel knew that better than most. The events of the past days had made that painfully clear. He'd seen too many folks lose everything in the blink of an eye, whether to storms, sickness, or men with dark intentions. And he couldn't shake the nagging thought, Whoever left Emily and Lily to die might not be finished. After breakfast, Samuel saddled his horse and made ready to ride into town for supplies. "Won't be gone long," he told Emily, keeping his tone casual, though his eyes were sharp with a silent warning. "Keep the door barred until I'm back." She nodded, but he caught the flicker of worry in her gaze. The ride into town was quiet, except for the rhythmic clop of hooves and the occasional hawk circling overhead. Samuel kept scanning the horizon. He'd lived alone for years, but now there were two people under his roof who depended on him. That responsibility felt heavier than any ranch chore he'd ever shouldered Dot at the general store. Samuel gathered flour, sugar, dried beans, coffee, and some extra ammunition just in case. The storekeeper, a chatty man named Harland, leaned on the counter. "Heard tell some riders were seen east of here," Harland said, lowering his voice. "3 men. Didn't look like they were hunting game." Samuel's jaw tightened. "You hear what they were after?" "Could be cattle." "Could be worse," Harland replied. "You be careful." On the way back, Samuel took the long route, cutting across ridges where he could see for miles. The prairie seemed calm, but calm could be a lie. By the time he reached his land, the sun was dipping low. As he rode up, Lily ran to the gate, waving. "You're back!" She shouted. Emily stood in the doorway, relief flooding her face. "Everything all right?" she asked. Samuel handed her the supplies and nodded, but inside he was already planning the next move. He couldn't just wait for trouble to find them. He'd have to get ahead of it. That night, as they ate supper, Emily told him more about what happened before he found them. Her voice was soft, but each word cut deep. "We were traveling with a small wagon train," she began. "There were whispers that one man had taken a liking to me. An unwelcome liking. When I refused him, things turned ugly. One morning, Lily and I woke to find the others gone. Our wagon was gone too. We were left with nothing." Samuel's hand stilled on his fork. "That's no accident," he said, his voice low. "That was a warning or worse." Emily nodded. "I thought maybe it was safer to just keep walking, but we wouldn't have made it much longer." After supper, Samuel stepped outside, lighting a cigarette he didn't really want, letting the cool night air bite at his skin. His mind was made up. Whoever had done this was still out there, and men like that didn't let things go. He had to be ready, because if they came looking for Emily and Lily again, this time they wouldn't find them alone or defenseless. The prairie was quiet, but Samuel could feel it, the kind of quiet that meant something was moving in the dark, just out of sight. He took one last drag, tossed the cigarette into the dirt, and headed inside. Tomorrow, things were going to change. The next morning broke with a pale light that barely touched the horizon. Samuel was already awake, sitting at the table with his coffee, staring at the door as if expecting it to open on its own. Emily stirred quietly in the other room, and Lily's soft laughter drifted from under the quilt. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt like family. But Samuel knew that was the kind of feeling a man could lose if he let his guard drop. Mid-morning, the air was unusually still. Not a bird sang, and even the wind seemed to have gone elsewhere. Samuel stepped out onto the porch, scanning the prairie. That's when he saw them, 3 riders far off in the distance, black shapes against the pale gold grass. They weren't drifting aimlessly. They were coming straight for the ranch. He went back inside, his tone calm but urgent. "Emily, take Lily to the root cellar. Don't come out until I call for you, and no matter what you hear, stay down." Emily's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. She grabbed Lily's hand and disappeared through the trap door in the kitchen floor. Samuel closed it behind them, pushing the heavy barrel of potatoes over the top. He checked his rifle, the same Winchester that had been with him for a dozen winters, and stepped back outside. The riders were closer now, 2 lean men and a bigger one in the middle. the kind of man whose smile would never reach his eyes. Samuel didn't wait for them to speak. "You're a long way from town," Samuel called out, his voice carrying across the open space. The big man grinned. "So are you. Heard you've been keeping company with a woman and her little girl. Pretty pair. Think you know where they belong?" Samuel's grip tightened on the rifle. "They belong right where they are. And you'd be smart to turn your horses around before you do something you can't take back." The man's grin faltered, replaced by something colder. "She made promises. Now she's running from M. We aim to collect." The moment hung in the air, sharp as a knife edge. Then one of the smaller men went for his gun. Samuel didn't hesitate. His first shot rang out like thunder, knocking the man clean off his saddle. Chaos erupted. The second rider charged forward, firing wildly. Samuel dove behind the water trough, splinters flying as bullets punched through the wood. He rolled to the side, aimed, and squeezed the trigger. The rider tumbled into the dust. Now only the big man remained, and he dismounted slowly, hands spread, a sneer on his lips. "You're a fool, Carter. You can't keep him safe forever." Samuel stepped out from cover, rifle still aimed. "Maybe not forever, but today's a good start." The man's hand twitched toward his pistol, but Samuel was faster. The shot echoed across the empty prairie, and the big man crumpled to the ground. Silence settled in, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. Samuel stood there for a long moment, breathing hard before lowering his rifle. He walked to each man, making sure they wouldn't get back up, then dragged the bodies away from the ranch. The prairie would take care of the rest. When he finally lifted the trap door, Emily's face was pale but steady. Lily clung to her mother's dress, eyes wide. "Is it over?" Emily asked. Samuel gave a slow nod. "For now." They came up into the light, and Emily stepped close, her voice low but firm. "You didn't have to do that for us." Samuel looked at her, the weight of the day settling in his bones. "Yeah, I did." The three of them stood there for a while, the wind finally returning to whisper through the grass. Out here, life was hard, and tomorrow would bring its own trials. But for the first time in years, Samuel felt something he thought he'd lost, a reason to keep fighting, and he knew, deep down, that as long as they stood together, no one would ever take that away.